The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi and welcome, Andrew Marty here from SACS, and today the topic is creating a diversity-friendly workforce. So let's just set some objectives about what it is that we're going to cover today. And objective number one is that we're going to talk to you about a thing called attitudes towards diversity. Attitudes toward diversity is a psychological characteristic which has been measured over the decades. There's been quite a bit of research into this thing called attitudes towards diversity. And really what it is it's the degree to which people have either positive or negative attitudes towards what might be called minority or outgroups. Outgroups is anything that we are not. So one of the things that we know is that where attitudes towards diversity are negative, then those negative attitudes can give rise to negative behaviours. So attitudes towards diversity matter. We're going to introduce you to a key theoretical framework about why people are prejudiced. And in other words, they have bad attitudes towards diversity, intolerant attitudes towards diversity. And the research literature suggests that there are kind of four reasons as to why people are like this. We're going to explain to you what those four reasons are. But we're also going to show you the results of a project that was undertaken in partnership between SACS Consulting and Deakin University, where we undertook this study into workplace prejudice and its causes. And some of the results are really interesting, and certainly they show some fascinating things about, for instance, how to use this kind of information to create a diversity-friendly workforce. So before I set off into the subject matter of the presentation, let me just let you know a couple of things. One is that we get lots of emails asking us for recordings of the webinar so that they can be forwarded to other people. This webinar is being recorded, so there is no problem about providing that for you, and you will also, if you're interested, get a copy of the slides as well. So that will be provided. So let's talk about what we mean by attitudes towards diversity. Well, as I mentioned, attitudes towards diversity relate to minorities or to outgroups. Outgroups being I'm a male, an outgroup is potentially female. I come from a particular ethnic background. Somebody who is from a different ethnic background is an outgroup, even if they're not a minority. So four areas of attitudes towards diversity which matter in an extremely wide range of workplaces across the world. One is ethnicity. So what that means is, to what degree is this person tolerant to people from different ethnic backgrounds from him or herself? So racism is what we're talking about here, where a person has low tolerance from an ethnicity point of view, then that's what we call racism. And certainly it tends to manifest in negative behaviours between ethnic groups. And we see that every day of the week when we pick up the newspaper and or watch the TV news. Gender. Well, there's been lots of really powerful stuff in the media over the past couple of years about toxic alpha males and about inappropriate interactions between with domineering behaviours from men to women, that kind of thing. So a person who has positive attitudes towards gender diversity is a person who is comfortable being supervised by a woman, a man who's being comfortable being supervised by a woman, vice versa. So gender tolerance is important. Age. As we know, the Australian workforce is aging rapidly because of the sort of demographic hump of the baby boomers becoming older by the day. So there are some people who are comfortable working with people who are elderly, some people who are not. And also there are people who are either tolerant or intolerant of young people. So age is an important issue from a diversity point of view. Then disability. In other words, organisations across Australia and in fact across the world are seeking to become more inclusive of people with disability, and that's a fantastic thing. And some people are fine with this. They're good at working with people with disability. They're tolerant, they're understanding, they're welcoming. Others are not so good. So there are four attitudes towards diversity which our clients tell us matter a lot to them. And so when people run into problems from a diversity point of view, it's often with one of those four. Now, they're not the only attitudes towards diversity issue, because gender identity diversity is another one, for instance, and private life. It could be things like interests. we've seen, for instance, examples. I saw an example recently, which is quite a sad example, where people who barracked for a particular football team didn't tend to barrack for another football team, and not only that, they hated people who did barrack for that football team. So there was a diversity issue in terms of private life. So this is not an exhaustive list, but when issues arise in workplace, the vast majority tend to be either under ethnicity, gender, age, or disability. So why are people interested in this? Well, there's a range of reasons. Trends of organisations operating globally. Now, if you happen to be, let's say you start your business in Sydney, Australia, and you are in Sydney, Australia for the entire life of your organisation, well, fine, you've got some diversity there, but nowhere near as much diversity as, let's say you get acquired by an international company and all of a sudden you've got individuals who've worked only in Sydney most of their careers, now they're stationed in Singapore. I had several years of being offshore myself, and it was really interesting. I was living and working mainly in Hong Kong, Singapore, Shanghai, and Jakarta. And one of the things that we saw is that there's some people who had fantastic interpersonal skills, and they were great employees in somewhat vanilla locations like Melbourne or Sydney, let's say. And when they went offshore, there were some of those who rose to that challenge and were fantastic, and other people were really challenged by that and had enormous difficulties. So as organisations become more global, this is a challenge to the tolerance of people who otherwise we might never have dreamed that they might have a problem with that kind of thing. Legal obligations. So we see all kinds of considerations about broadening employee profiles. And in fact, in the United States of America, in many states, you have rules where you must have a certain number of people with certain ethnic backgrounds, let's say, to ensure that you are not discriminating against them. Ethical priorities. Many organisations are believing that good governance is not just about obeying the law, it's about taking an ethical perspective and an ethical position on things. And we believe that we should stand for, gender diversity, let's say. And we're seeing that a lot right now, aren't we, across boards in government, where the ministers are insisting that there be a balancing up of gender diversity, and all of that is taking place right now. Reputational concerns. Well, clearly, if we consider ourselves to be an ethical organisation, we'd better demonstrate it by the way that we make our hires and the way that we move people ahead. So there are reputational concerns, and those reputational concerns may well affect the well-being of our organisation, the staff that we employ, those kind of things. And finally, a desire to achieve high performance. So when somebody is ignoring certain talent sources, that's a really dodgy decision these days. I mean, talent is so crucial and it's so competitive to get good talent that if you say, hey, in this job we can't have a woman, well, you're cutting out half of the population, and you may well be cutting out high performers who could advantage your organisation. So people are really drawing the conclusion that in order to be an optimally performing organisation, you can't have that kind of prejudice. It's just inimical to high performance. So let's talk about some of the research that's been done so far in this attitudes towards diversity space. And in order to achieve workplace diversity, you've got to understand that there are individual differences which affect people's attitudes towards diversity. And you see a number of references at the bottom, the Adorno et al. Article, Allport in, going way back 50 and 54, and more recently Hodson and Don't. And basically what these research studies did is that they looked at some of the things that might affect people's tolerance to and receptiveness to people from diverse backgrounds. So a person's personality. Isn't that a fascinating question? Is there a diversity-friendly personality? And to foreshadow one of the findings, I'm going to say, well, yes, there is, because it seems that there are certain personality characteristics that make people more tolerant and more ready to accept people who are different from themselves. And there are other personality profiles which make them less so. And we're going to show you some research evidence for that in just a moment. Values. Now, does a person's value set make them more tolerant or less tolerant? Now, let me just go back to personality for a second. And personality is kind of universally agreed to have a pretty strong genetic streak to it. So if there is a strong genetic streak to personality, and some will say as high as 80%, others will say as low as sort of 50%, but however you look at it, most researchers in the world seem to believe that it's about it's majority genetically determined. Well, if there is a genetic personality, then what it might suggest is that there are some people who might be dispositionally, almost genetically inclined to intolerance. And in fact, I think that there's quite a bit of research evidence for that. On the other hand, there are people who are dispositionally inclined to be tolerant. Well, if you're going to try to create a diversity-friendly workforce, it's a good idea to recruit people who are going to be dispositionally tolerant over a long period of time. And if personality is genetically determined, we know that it doesn't change much over the course of a person's life. If they're tolerant at 25, they're likely to be tolerant at 60, let's say. On the other hand, values, one of the things that we know about values is that they are largely acquired during the course of a person's life. So Jeremy Anglim from Deakin University and myself had a paper published in 2017 where we tried to predict people's value sets from their personality. What we found is that you could partially do it, and the average of the values, which varies a bit from value to value, but the average would probably, you could predict about 30% of a person's values from their personality. So they're not entirely personality free, but the vast majority of them are learned in the course of a person's life. And one of the things that we know, if you measure the values of people in different countries, they will be very different, even though personality profiles country to country are actually quite similar. So that says that they are largely learned. And we do also know Shalom Schwartz, who's one of the world's leading researchers on this topic, has measured how people's value sets change when they move from country to country. And he has shown that their value sets kind of morph in order to become more like the social milieu that they've moved into. On the other hand, personality doesn't seem to be quite as flexible as that. It seems to be much more sticky. And, so an angry, cranky person will tend to be an angry, cranky person when they get older. Actually, sadly, there's some evidence that they become slightly more cranky as they get older. But so the sort of folk tale of the cranky old man, cranky old woman effect, well, it turns out to be true. So values can affect how tolerant people are. And then cognitive ability. So that's an interesting thought, isn't it? Could it be that how smart you are could have an effect on how tolerant you are? So if a person is very smart, could they be more tolerant? Could they be less tolerant? Well, we're going to show you the answer to that in just a little while. So let's talk about the three components, because in the study, what we did is we measured people's cognitive ability, we measured their personality, we measured their value set, and we measured their attitudes towards diversity to see if we could develop a relationship between those. And that's what this study is all about. Firstly, let's talk about cognitive ability. Cognitive ability at work is often characterized as three main things. There are other forms of cognitive ability. By the way, cognitive ability can be called things like aptitudes. It can be called things like IQ, intelligence quotient. How smart you are, basically, is what cognitive ability is about. So verbal reasoning is the ability to use words. And the definition of a person who is high in verbal reasoning is that this is a person who's able to deal with complex issues and express and explain them very simply to other people. So if I am high in verbal reasoning, then what I'm able to do is to take reasonably complicated ideas, find a very simple and economical way to explain them to other people, and these other people go, yeah, I get it. That's verbal reasoning. Now, verbal reasoning is also about speed. People who have high verbal reasoning tend to be able to write things more quickly. They tend to be able to remember verbal issues or verbal structures more quickly and more effectively and more enduringly than people with low IQ in respect of verbal reasoning. So that's point number one. Point number two is a thing called numerical reasoning. Now, numerical reasoning, unlike verbal reasoning, certain jobs will require numerical reasoning and other jobs won't. So if you're an accountant, let's say, you would expect that person to be high in verbal reasoning. I can tell you from personal experience, by the way, that we psych there's plenty of accountants who are not particularly high in numerical reasoning. So that's a worry. But numerical reasoning, the ability to use numbers, whereas verbal reasoning, most jobs require people to communicate. The other thing I'd say about numerical reasoning is that it can be a little bit of a glass ceiling capability for people. So when you move into an organization at lower levels, you may have no need whatever to use numerical reasoning. When you rise up the ranks and you're all of a sudden dealing with statistics, mathematics, budgets, performance targets, that kind of stuff, well, maybe your numerical reasoning has to click in. That can be, by the way, one of the reasons why we can turn our best technician into our worst leader, because if they're asked to step up into a leadership role which requires them to understand budgets and those other sort of financial matters, then it may well be that if they can't do that, that's going to be a glass ceiling effect which holds them back in their career. The third component of cognitive ability is a thing called abstract reasoning, the ability to problem solve and think strategically. Now, abstract reasoning tests, if you've ever seen one, they're usually in the form of what's called progressive matrices. So progressive matrices are shapes, and you get a shape that shape number 1, shape number 2, shape number 3, and you're typically asked to choose what shape number 4 would be by virtue of a pattern that is established in shape number 1, shape number 2, shape number 3. Now, when people see these shapes on a screen, they think, well, what has this got to do with the ability to deal with the world? In fact, it turns out to have quite a deal to do with the ability to deal with the world. Because when a person can see the logical sequence in these abstract reasoning tests, these progressive matrices, what you'll find is that it's plugging into a function in their brain which is actually about seeing this sequence and links in the world. So people who are high in abstract reasoning are often able to forecast what's likely to happen. People who are low in abstract reasoning may well be the sort of people who walk around the world saying, well, who would have thought this could happen? You know, it's the capacity to understand the links between things. When we're recruiting people to cut code for us, development types in our IT team, I place enormous emphasis on abstract reasoning, because I find that when people are, let's say, 95th percentile on abstract reasoning, they cut code really quickly and really accurately. That is a fantastic predictor of IQ performance. Anyway, so that's what we mean by cognitive ability in this study. And the question we've asked is, do any of these things have anything to do with attitudes towards diversity? Can we predict attitudes towards diversity based on people's cognitive ability score, their IQ? Then we're going to talk to you about personality. Now, the model of personality that we're using in this study is the Hexaco model of personality. Hexaco standing for H for honesty, humility, E for emotionality, X for extroversion, A for agreeableness, C for conscientiousness, O for openness. And all of that adds up to Hexaco. Now, the Hexaco model of personality was discovered in the early to mid-2000s, and it was discovered by two guys by the name of Ki-Bim Lee and Mike Ashton in an extremely big study that took place across 10 different countries and across 7 different language groups. And basically, up until the Hexaco was discovered, this is sometimes called the 6-factor model of personality, by the way, a thing called the Big Five, the 5-factor model of personality, was very much the dominant model of personality. In fact, if you look at most papers in organisational or other psychology in personality, they'll still be talking about the Big Five. But the Hexaco has some really valuable innovations, and perhaps the most valuable is that a new personality factor was discovered, and it's this here. It's a thing called honesty humility. Honesty humility is the degree to which somebody is honest and truthful and straightforward and not arrogant. So that's what the humility bit means. So sincerity means I don't manipulate people. Fairness means I don't cheat. Greed avoidance means I'm not overly greedy. And modesty means I'm not arrogant. Now, this is a really useful discovery in the world of personality, because this predicts how likely you are to go to jail. People who have low scores in honesty humility go to jail more often than people who have high scores on honesty humility. Now, if that's not worth knowing, I don't know what is. In our research, we have undertaken many studies into things like counterproductive work behaviours. Counterproductive work behaviours is organisational psychology code for people stealing stuff, people bullying other people taking sick days when they're not really sick. And what we've discovered is that this honesty humility scale is a good predictor of that. People who score low in honesty humility do all that bad stuff far more often. It's also an indicator of a thing called psychopathy. Everybody talks about psychopaths. The studies that have been conducted into psychopathy since the Hexaco model of personality has been discovered have found that if you have tests of psychopathy, they correlate with this honesty humility score, which is to say people who are low in honesty humility are more likely to be psychopaths. For those of you who are into this kind of stuff, they're also much more likely to be narcissistic or Machiavellian. So that's honesty, humility. Second thing we're going to, oh, by the way, given that this correlates with so much bad stuff, you might be inclined to wonder if it will correlate with racism and sexism as well. And we will see. Next thing is emotionality, the degree to which a person is emotionally stable or unstable. So fearfulness, anxiety, dependence means I don't like to do things by myself. I have to do it in the comfort of others. And finally, sentimentality. Sentimentality is the degree to which I emphasize or perhaps even overemphasize with other people. So people who are high in emotionality are low in resilience. So that's an interesting question. Does a low resilience score, high emotionality score, make a person less or more likely to be tolerant? Extroversion. Well, are you an extrovert? Are you an introvert? Well, people think of extroverts as being people-ish kind of people, and that's true, but they're also optimistic people. That's what liveliness means. People who are high in liveliness are sort of chirpy, cheerful, optimistic people. Social self-esteem means, hey, I'm comfortable in my own skin. Social boldness means, hey, I'm confident being out in the world. Sociability means I like people. Liveliness is the chirpy, cheerful, optimistic bit. Agreeableness. In the Hexaco model of personality, when a person is agreeable, they're forgiving. They don't hold grudges. They're gentle. They don't like being harsh on people. They're flexible, which means, okay, you want to do it this way, go ahead. Or even, I'll come with you. And finally, patience means I am slow to anger. When a person is high in patience in the Hexaco model of personality, they are a non-angry person. They've got a long fuse. Now, of course, the reverse is also true. If you're low in forgiveness, you're a grudge carrier. If you're low in gentleness, you're harsh. If you're low in flexibility, it means you're the sort of person who wants everything done his or her own way. And if you're low in patience, you've got a short fuse. Conscientiousness. So a person who is high in conscientiousness is somebody who's organized, they're hardworking, they're detail-minded, and prudence means that they're thoughtful about taking risks. In other words, they don't take radical or improper risks. They're not impulsive. This is the other component of resilience, by the way. Emotionality is a component of resilience, and so is conscientiousness. So if you want resilient staff, recruit people who are low in emotionality and high in conscientiousness, and that's a kind of a personality definition of resilience. I can cope, I can get over bad stuff, I can adjust the way that I do things in order to cope with new circumstances. Finally, we have this thing called openness to experience, openness for shorthand. Openness to experience means I'm broad-minded. I like new stuff. I can cope with new things. Aesthetic appreciation is the degree to which I like, well, art and music and that stuff. Inquisitiveness means the degree to which I'm kind of curious about the world. And also I tend to know a lot of things like, general knowledge type stuff tends to come to people who are high in inquisitiveness. Creativity, I like to do new stuff. And unconventionality, I'm comfortable with stuff that seems different or unusual to me. Now, that's an interesting one. I wonder if people who are kind of broad-minded might be less likely to be racist. Maybe openness to experience could be an indicator of tolerance. Anyway, we'll show you in just a little while. And finally, you have this interstitial trade. Interstitial means it just doesn't fit into any of these six. It's these big things, openness, they're called factors. These little things, you see there's 4 of these under each one of the factors, they're called facets. This is actually a facet, it's not a factor, and that's why it doesn't have a big capital letter on it, and it's not getting added to the hexaco bit. So this altruism thing means I'm kind of kind to people, I'm gentle to people, I want to help people. So that's personality. Then we have values, and the Schwartz values framework we're using for this study. We have tested thousands and thousands of people using the Schwartz values profile. Very good instrument for measuring a person's values. What Schwartz discovered, building on the work of a gentleman by the name of Milton Rockich and others, is that your average person seems to have about 10 values that drive them. Now, values are in effect goals. And so I think one of the things that's interesting if you think of personality, personality is sort of almost like being hardwired to like or dislike or feel comfortable with something. Values are much more kind of, I believe that this is a good thing because I've been told that this is a good thing. As the sociologists would say, significant others in my life have coached, guided, inducted, trained me to believe that something is good or bad. And that's what these values are. Now, so values are a big determinant of whether a person's likely to fit into a particular organization. So, for instance, if I will pick one and I'll say achievement. Achievement means I'm a really ambitious person. So a person who's high in achievement is somebody who really wants to get ahead. Now, if I am like that, so I'm high on this, and I join an organization where everybody's low in this, then I'm less likely to fit in. So power in some roles, or perhaps that's quite a little the wrong way to put it. Power is the degree to which I want to dominate other people. And I was going to say, in some roles that's appropriate. It's actually probably not appropriate in any role, but there are some roles that tend to attract people who are keen on power. Politics, obviously, tends to attract people who are power seekers. Because I mean, well, you're going to run a government. Well, that's powerful. If you're going to be a minister of the crown, that's powerful. So power is all about wanting to dominate either people or resources. This, by the way, is one of two values that could be said to be either good or bad. And the reason for that is that in research that we've conducted, people who are high power seekers are more likely to undertake negative behaviors. Now, it's not enough that if a person's high in power to presume that they're going to do that. There are other things like their personality profile and some other aspects of their values that might determine whether they'll do bad stuff. But it is fair to say that when people have a high power score, there is a risk factor associated with this. And finally, hedonism. Hedonism, not finally, the third value that I'm going to talk about is hedonism. Hedonism is the degree to which I want to have pleasurable experiences, the degree to which I believe it's important to do enjoyable things in life. What kind of enjoyable things? It's up to the individual. Hedonism could be sport, it could be films, it could be food, wine, whatever. It's all to do with the personal taste, but it's a goal that I've got to have pleasant stuff in my life. Now, I said finally before. What I meant was finally for this segment. You see, this relates to self-enhancement. Now, this becomes important in the study that we did because self-enhancement is a kind of a subset of the 10. You see, there are 4 of these anchors that are around the outside of this circumflex, this round thing. And self-enhancement is the degree to which I want to get ahead. I want to enhance myself. We move down to openness to change, and there's really a couple of things that relate to openness to change. One is stimulation, and stimulation is the belief that it's a good thing to do new and different stuff. And when a person is high on the value of stimulation, you'll notice that they will often be comfortable with taking a risk in order to do that new and different stuff. And self-direction is all about, I want to run my own show. I want to have authority over the way I do things. And you see, hedonism is also stretching slightly into this quadrant down here, openness to change. So people who score high on hedonism, stimulation, and self-direction are usually the types of people who believe it's a good thing to be open to change. Then we have this area called self-transcendence. And self-transcendence is the opposite, in a sense, of self-enhancement. Self-enhancement is I'm going to advance my own interests. Self-transcendence is I'm going to advance the interests of other people. So universalism. What universalism literally means is I want to make the world a better place. Now, we psych test many thousands of people in the not-for-profit sector, and not surprisingly, you find a lot of them are very high in this characteristic called universalism. A person who is universalistic is often somebody who cares about environmental sustainability or social justice, and if they've got a really high score, it will be both. Now, this, by the way, is one of the reasons why the various green parties around the world tend not just to be environmental parties, they also tend to have a social platform, because social justice and environmental sustainability seem to be very coherent value sets in the human brain. We're not entirely sure why, by the way, but it does seem to be very consistent right across the world that when a person is universalistic, that means in general they are likely to be high in both environmental sustainability commitment and social justice commitment. So then we have benevolence. And benevolence means I want to help the people who are around me, my family, my friends, my colleagues. And so the person who I am with right now, I am going to help them. Now, that's a little different from universalism, because the social justice orientation of universalism is sort of a little bit more abstract. So caring about the starving in Africa, caring about the people who are disadvantaged by our legal system, caring about refugees. Now, benevolence, you got to know that person. So you could be a very benevolent person, but relatively modest in universalism, or you could be high in universalism, which means the general value is there, but caring about the people around you, maybe not so much. Now, because of the mathematical makeup of this model, often what you'll find is people will be high on both of these. So if they're high on universalism, they'll be high on benevolence, but you do get individual variability. So that's self-transcendence. I want to get beyond myself and I want to make the world a better place. And then conservation is I want to keep what I've got. I want to be safe. So security is all about taking the view that it's really important to be safe. It's really important to be secure. It's really important that all the people I know and love are safe. So we don't want war. We don't want stress. We don't want evil. Security is important to us. Tradition is all about obeying the dictates of my family or my society or my religion. So that's kind of like conformity, but conformity is a more broader kind of a perspective, which is I respect rules. I think that rules are a good thing, and I'm quite happy to accept good and sensible rules. Now, conformity, by the way, is one of the two values which can be said to be good or bad, because when people are relatively low in conformity, you get a couple of things. One, we know that they are far more likely to do bad stuff. They're more likely to bully and harass and steal and all of those sorts of things. And as I mentioned earlier, the other is power. So if you get somebody who's a real power seeker and low in conformity, well, that means they don't care about your rules and they want to dominate. And that can be a cause of negative behaviors. So those are the three types of measures we're using in this study. How smart are you? What's your personality like? And what's your value set? Now, values and personality can conflict. So I'll just use one simple example, stimulation. Stimulation is a belief that new and different stuff is good. If we go back to personality, openness to experience is a kind of an instinctive, natural feeling that new and different stuff is good. And we see sometimes when people's values, so let's say you are high in openness to experience, and then you're also high in the value of stimulation. Well, what that's saying is not only do I have a natural inclination to be broad-minded, I actually believe consciously that it's a good goal to be broad-minded. That can happen. We also see the opposite, where people's values compete or contradict their personality characteristics. And I'll give you another really practical example. Let's say somebody's high in benevolence, which means that they believe it's important to be kind and nice to people and to be somebody who can kind of be relied on, if you want to put it that way. But what about the same person being low in agreeableness, which means they're angry? Well, this happens relatively regularly because I've seen it multiple times myself. What that means is that the bulk of the time, what you'll see is that these people will be kind and nice to people. But what you sometimes find is that, bearing in mind that there is a strong genetic streak to personality, what you can find is that when things get really tough, these people become very angry and might snap at people, or even more extremely, might do something more significant than that. Trait anger, by the way, we know is a cause of negative behaviors. So that's where the values would compete with each other. All right, so let's get on to the question of attitudes towards diversity. So in this study, we had a couple of guiding questions. One is, what predicts workplace prejudice? I mean, what predicts that people are likely to do these bad things, these racism things or sexism or whatever? And then what we wanted to do is we wanted to find out how important are things like demographics. I mean, that's an interesting question. If you are older, younger, if you come from certain backgrounds, does any of that have an effect on how intolerant you're likely to be? But then, of course, does your cognitive ability, how smart you are, does that have an effect on how likely you are to be prejudiced against people? Personality, does your personality predict this? Do your values predict this? Well, let's have a look. So I mentioned that I was going to expose you to a model of tolerance and intolerance. And in fact, here's a model which is based on 4 really separate streams that take place in the research. One of them, the very first, is a thing called the social dominance pathway. Now, so the social dominance pathway says, well, I really want to be dominant in this world. I really want to be on top of other people. It may be fair to say, incidentally, that most people don't actually make conscious decisions about this. They just want to do it. So if I believe that it's important for me to be socially dominant, that I must be on top, well, look, I mean, maybe I'm going to take the view that people who are from a different social group are simply not up to it, because that allows me to be socially dominant and I can go around running them down. So, and we know that there is research evidence for this pathway. So one of the things that you might look for there is low honesty humility, because it says I'm going to shape the world, I'm going to manipulate the world, I'm going to be dishonest with the world to give myself the opportunity to be dominant. It might be also, if the social dominance pathway is true, then maybe the values of self-enhancement could be important in predicting this, as opposed to self-transcendent. Maybe self-transcending people are not, therefore, as likely to be prejudiced to other people. So the second component here is a thing called the ego threat pathway. Well, I really self-doubt. I just honestly don't know about my own self-esteem. I really don't feel comfortable in my own skin. I just really worry about whether I'm worthy. Well, what do people do under those circumstances? Well, why not make other people even less worthy? So I'm going to, these people here are different from me. They are even worse than I am. So I can shore up my own fragile ego. And so one of the things that you might find is that if this ego threat pathway is true, low social self-esteem might be an indicator of that. So people with low social self-esteem might be the sort of people who see an ego threat and therefore want to run down other groups. What about a conservatism pathway? That's an interesting one. So it may be fair to say that some of the things that we've seen in recent times that have come out of the world of negative outcomes in diversity could be said to be associated with old values, like 1950s values, where women have got to stay in the home, and people from different ethnicities should go back to where they come from. These are all old-fashioned perspectives. So maybe some people are intolerant purely and simply because they're holding on to old values that haven't changed as the world's changed. Well, that's an interesting one. Now, what would predict whether people's tendencies to do this are likely to come about in the real live workplace or in the world more generally? Well, in fact, if conservatism is driving this, maybe these are people who are low in openness because they just don't want the world to change. The personality characteristic of openness says, I'm ready to take on new ideas, and values related to conservatism as opposed to openness to change. So if people are in the Schwartz profile up in the right-hand corner strongly, well, maybe that means that they're just going to be people who are, well, no, I want things to be like they were 10, 20, 30 years ago. I can't cop this. And the final one, the fourth pathway, is low cognitive complexity pathway. So the idea here is that, well, if I'm not that smart, maybe it's better for me to see the world in very simple, literally black and white terms. And so this is good, this is bad. Now, as soon as you start saying, well, actually, I used to believe that this is bad, but in fact, I met this person who was really good, and that disproves it. I met this other person who was very kind and helpful to me, and this person, he's part of my in-group, but he's just a really bad person to deal with, and she's very intolerant. You see what I'm saying? There's a complexity about all of that. So that's a really interesting idea, because if it's a low cognitive complexity perspective that's causing people to be intolerant, and therefore they see the world in simple black and whites, well, okay, if I'm not very smart, maybe I'd be more likely to do that. And also low openness, which means I just don't have a very broad-minded approach to these things. I want everything to be simple. Those are the four pathways. So just to describe the study, we got 731 people to complete a survey, the 731 are people who completed all of the survey, because there were considerably more who completed parts of this survey. And so these people who completed this survey completed measures of workplace prejudice from a thing called Attitudes Towards Diversity scale. And we measured also the SACS scales for workplace diversity, including gender, ethnicities, older workers, and workers with a disability. Now, how this worked, it's really important to understand this. These people did not set these psych tests under what's called low-stakes environment. Low-stakes environment was you get somebody to say, okay, well, fill this personality test in for me because we're doing a study. That's low stakes because they basically fill this questionnaire in. There's no consequences for it. Nothing happens. All of the candidates, all of the people who were in this study were people who had completed these instruments, the cognitive ability test, the personality test, and the values test, when applying for jobs through the SACS psychometric assessment portal. Now, the reason I think that's very important is, do people fake psych tests? Well, Jeremy and I have another paper that shows, yeah, they do. They don't fake them that much and they don't fake them that well, but they do fake psych tests. So if we can get an effect size out of effect size means the study shows something that's measurable in scientific terms. If we can get an effect size out of a database of people who filled in psych tests all in high stakes environments, well, that just makes it stronger than just asking them the same questions in research settings. There's nothing wrong with asking them the question in research setting, but in effect, this is setting a higher bar. And by the way, in most studies of this type, 731 is a very big sample. Many theories and findings in organisational psychology is based on samples of 200 people or whatever. Interestingly, slightly more females than males, which is sort of unusual. If you look at the 38,000 people that we've psych tested, it's actually almost 50-50 and slightly more male from memory, something like 52%, something like that. But anyway, there we have it. So we measured workplace prejudice, and we used an instrument that measures directly workplace prejudice. This is an internationally validated instrument. This is one of the instruments that we used. And what we wanted to show you here was the degree to which people agreed with these things. So it says, I agree with this, or I strongly agree with this. So for instance, let's look at the low ones. The ethnic individuals in my organisation have a greater degree of difficulty getting along with other people. So only 4% of people agreed with that. All right, seems that ethnic individuals in supervisory positions are ineffective relating to other supervisors. Only 3% agree with that. So that's really small, isn't it? And in fact, I find ethnic workers seem to be less productive on average. There's only 1% agree with that. So they're really, really low responses. I think one of the things that we've got to understand here, though, is that if you look at the next category, apart from agree or strongly agree, then you've got the one that says, well, I don't either agree or disagree with this. Just think about that from a diversity point of view. I don't agree or disagree. I'm not sure. That's an interesting thing. So let's say if I think that ethnic employees, the proposition to put to me that ethnic employees are not so effective, and I don't know, 30% of the workforce says, well, yeah, I'm not sure about that. Well, it's actually not a great result from a diversity point of view either, is it? I mean, because in general, the research evidence is that, in fact, ethnic employees are no less productive whatsoever. And what you really want is where very few people said, well, I'm not sure. You'd want them to say, well, no, it's not. Anyway, that's an interesting point. What you find here is that if we look at the 19 here, it seems that some of the women I work with need to be more assertive to be effective supervisors. I have often picked up the slack for some of my female co-workers who are less productive, which may suggest that people are kind of unkinder to women than they are to people from different ethnic backgrounds, which is an interesting point of itself. But I mean, 19 and 18% agreeing with those propositions, that's not nothing, is it? So here's a couple of reversed items. So, all in all, I would say that ethnic workers are just as productive as other workers. 85% of people agree with that. Most of the ethnic supervisors in my organisation possess the same leadership. 72. So you can see what we've done is that we've used some reversed items. Now, when we do this kind of stuff, I know that drives a lot of our participants nuts to have these reversed items. There is a debate in psychology about whether it's necessary or not. In general, most people would say, yeah, you should have some reversed items. So that's measuring workplace prejudice, the degree to which people are prejudiced. Then you have this thing called proactive attitudes towards diversity. So this is not asking people to express opinions about how worse these ethnic employees or women are. We're actually saying positive stuff. This is purposefully. We would have a more creative work environment if more women and ethnic individuals were hired. As you see, only 31% agree with that. Workers who are prejudiced have no place in an organisation. Sadly, only 60% of people agree with that. I guess if I was barracking for this workforce or for this survey, I might have said, well, gee, I hope that we might have got that up to 90 or something, but never mind. I feel that diversity is good for an organisation, even if it means I'll have a supervisor who's different of different ethnic origin. Good, 90%. Yep. If a member of my work group were racist or prejudiced, he or she would be less likely to fit in. Yeah, that's 70% of saying that. Anyway, you get the picture. Most of the women in management positions do an outstanding job. Yeah, 59. You see that they vary one from another. So we have this thing called proactive attitude towards diversity. So let's show you the results. Now, I know you all love correlation coefficients. Well, actually, no. As I like to say, I used to lecture in multivariate data analysis, and sometimes when I'm presenting, get people to put up their hands if they like statistics, and virtually I'm the only one in the room that does so. Let me keep this as simple for you as possible. The column that you really have to worry about here is this first one, because these are correlations with workplace diversity. And what we're showing here is that a proactive attitude towards diversity, which is I believe that it's a good thing to have ethnic and gender diversity, you're getting quite a strong negative correlation with workplace prejudice. In other words, people who are prejudiced, they don't believe that it's a good thing at all. So that's why you're getting this negative correlation of 0.5. What that means is that people who are high in workplace prejudice will have a low score in this proactive attitudes towards diversity questionnaire, which is this questionnaire I showed you back here. It's the answers to these things. So, not surprisingly, if you're prejudiced, you don't have a proactive positive attitude. Now, I think one of the things that is really interesting here is that you've got female prejudice, ethnic prejudice, elder prejudice, and disability prejudice. Now, this overall workplace prejudice, so that's measured by this international instrument, and the SACS measure measures these four very specific forms of prejudice. I don't like women, I don't like ethnic people who are ethnically different from me, I don't like old people, and I don't like people with disability. What you notice here is the consistency of these correlations. And what that means, ladies and gentlemen, is that if you are intolerant in one respect, you are highly likely to be intolerant in another respect. So people who don't like women often don't like people with disability, let's say. That is really important. We extracted this information in another way to verify this. We used a technique called factor analysis, and we factor analyzed everybody's scores on these four things. We found that we got significantly different factors for these four things, so they stood up as individual measures. But what we also got is what's called a super factor that was over the top of all of these, which I call bigotry. Jeremy Anglin wrote the article on this, which is under submission at the moment. He didn't call it bigotry. He didn't like the terminology. I totally respect that. Anyway, but it is fair to say that if you're bigoted in one way, you're more likely to be bigoted in another way. So that's message number one. Tolerance and intolerance both appear to be general. So this is where we split up the correlations a little bit more. And once more, so we've got workplace prejudice here. And what we did is we looked firstly at some demographic variables. So gender, you notice these bolded ones are the ones that are statistically significant correlation. And perhaps not surprisingly, women were a little bit less likely to be prejudiced against women than men are. So, the fact that you're a woman makes you a bit, and that's why you're getting this significant correlation. English as a second language, there's a slight tendency. These are pretty weak correlations, by the way. They're small correlations, even though they are statistically significant. But what it says is that if you come from an English as a second language group, you're likely to have a slightly less tolerant attitude to diversity. So high ESL means low proactive attitude towards diversity. Interestingly, foreign born, no significant correlation at all. So it doesn't seem to matter whether you're foreign born or not. And over 55, well, I'm over 55, and let me tell you, we are not dispositionally intolerant as a group. That's, of course, there are individuals who might be that way. Also, a person who has a disability. Interestingly, we didn't find in any respect a significant correlation there. So people with disability don't seem to be either tolerant or intolerant of disability prejudice as much as you might expect. So what we find, I guess, the generalization that you would say is that the demographic backgrounds of people was perhaps surprisingly unable to predict how likely people were to be prejudiced. If we look at intelligence, however, well, it's a slightly different story, because you're now getting up to 20-point correlation of minus 0.23 about workplace prejudices. So people who aren't that smart tend to be more prejudiced. And people who are smart tend to have a more positive proactive attitude towards diversity. Female prejudice, people who are smart are less likely to be intolerant of women. Honesty, humility. So in short, cognitive ability can be shown to be related to workplace prejudice. The smarter you are, the less likely you are to be prejudiced. Once more, please understand that I'm not making conclusions at an individual basis. I'm making conclusions at a population basis, because of course there are some people who are terribly smart and very racist, and some people who are not so smart and yet extremely tolerant of other people. Honesty, humility, the personality characteristic that I said predicts whether you're likely to go to jail, also predicts whether you're likely to be intolerant. So a person who is a person who's honest and truthful is less likely to be prejudiced against people and more likely to have a positive attitude towards diversity. This is a really good thing. And you see the correlations go right across the scale. In fact, a 0.25 for disability. So people who are high in honesty, humility are unlikely to be against or to be intolerant to people with disability. If we look at emotionality, no effect size there. However, when we get to extroversion, people who are high in extroversion, less likely to be prejudiced, more likely to be tolerant. Extroversion, I guess, one of the components of extroversion, they like people. So maybe they like all people, irrespective of whether it's gender or whatever. Agreeableness, okay. Well, people who are low in agreeableness tend to be a little bit more likely to be intolerant to people with a disability. Conscientiousness, no effect. Openness to experience, then when you get a big effect here for proactive attitudes towards diversity. And what that's saying is that open-minded people are people who are likely to take a positive attitude to diversity in the workplace. Conservatism. So these are two values. So conservatism as a value versus self-enhancement as a value. And what you find is that conservatives are more likely to undertake prejudice. So that's sort of evidence for the conservatism pathway of the causes for intolerance. And self-enhancement, people who are really aggressive self-enhancers, they're slightly more likely to be workplace prejudiced than others. And what that means is that the four pathway model in its various components is supported by this data. Now, if we look at these things of personality, you remember that I said that there were factors and facets in personality? These are all factors: honesty, humility, and you remember that there were four little things underneath this one big thing of honesty, humility, and the same with emotionality, agreeableness, conscientiousness, etc. So if you split these characteristics up into what are called facets, we then see that, for instance, in a person's values, there are certain values that are much better predictors of workplace prejudice, workplace intolerance. So power. Remember I said power seeking can be a bad thing? Well, as it turns out, people who are high in power tend to be more intolerant. Security, people who are security conscious tend to be more intolerant. Tradition, people who are highly traditional, and maybe the tradition is a tradition of intolerance to certain people. Maybe that's what's going on there. And finally, in terms of values, universalism. So a person who's highly universalistic, I want to make the world a better place, they are much less likely to want to be intolerant to people from different genders, ethnicities, disability, all that stuff. Then we move on to cognitive ability. Now, numerical ability, numerical reasoning, doesn't seem to be that much of a contributor to a person's likelihood to be intolerant. But verbal ability is a big contributor. You'll notice that 0.27, that's the biggest correlation in the entire set of correlations. So if you're good at words, you are much less likely to be intolerant. Isn't that a fascinating finding? Now, why is that? Yeah, well, these are relatively recent findings, and we've had a chance to discuss them with a few other researchers. And one of the things that people have suggested is maybe if you're highly verbally able, you can kind of understand and relate to other people better. We don't know, but I think that what we can conclude is that verbal ability is a good predictor of this. Abstract ability is really the ability to solve problems, as I said earlier, and we're getting just a borderline effect size out of there, a statistically significant correlation. When we split personality up into its facets, what we find is that modesty is a really big contributor. In short, arrogant people are much less likely to be tolerant than people who are not arrogant. We're also getting a good effect out of social self-esteem, which is evidence for that social, that ego vulnerability pathway. People who don't feel confident in their own skin might be more likely to be intolerant. Greedy people, less likely to be tolerant, and manipulative people, less likely to be tolerant. And aesthetic appreciation and altruism is about being kind to people. Not surprisingly, that's related to tolerance. And aesthetic appreciation, people who don't like art, interestingly, and maybe that's just because they're not broad-minded. And Jeremy Anglin, the researcher from Deakin University, who we worked with on this project, says, well, maybe it's a sort of linked to a kind of a left of field or even left-wing perspective on life, and maybe that's what's going on there. All right, now the last of the data that we're going to show you is that this is what we're calling regression models. Now, regression models are where you combine a bunch of things to try to predict things. So here we've got, over the page, we've got simple correlations. Here you've got what are called regression models. And to cut straight to the chase, we're getting very little out of the demographics. So workplace prejudice, you're getting, this is a measure of accuracy of prediction, if you want to put it that way. You're getting a correlation or a multiple R-squared, as a call, of about 0.0707. So not much of an effect at all. And abilities, so about 5% narrow, which means that you're dealing with them in separately verbal, numerical, and abstract, which is the three cognitive abilities. What you're getting about is about 7%. Personality, just by itself, about 9%. Personality narrow, which is the facets, 25 facets of the hexagon, so those 4 little things under the 6 big things, about 13%. The values, about 13%, about 1.3% if you look at them in their broad sense, which is only 2 of them. But if you look at the 10 values, you're getting up to 13%. Now, just to cut to the chase, if you look at all of the components together, you can get a proactive attitude towards diversity prediction of about 23% odd. And when it comes to prejudice, about 21%. So that really raises an interesting question. 21%, is that worth having? Well, imagine if you could reduce the intolerance in your workplace across all categories by 21%. Actually, I think that is worth having. I guess a couple of things to say about that. Firstly, if we're saying 21%, let's make some comparisons. The average interview is accurate to the tune of about 12%. That's what the research says to us. Reference checks are accurate to the tune of about 7%. So 21% is massively better than 7% or 12%. I mean, the absolute best recruitment methodologies ever created from a mix of best practice interviews and reference checks and everything seem to be about 25%. Well, you're nearly there just on the question of tolerance. But of course, if you test for these things, this is not the only benefit you're going to get, because when people have positive scores on these things, you get a lot of other positives, like productivity, like tolerance, like the ability to relate to other people. So I think it's worth measuring this stuff. So out of this, we upgraded our attitudes towards diversity measures. I mean, we've been measuring gender and ethnicity for quite some time, but we added measures for age and disability, largely because we have lots of clients in the aged care sector or organisations who want people tolerant to elderly people and disability. I mean, many organisations that we deal with are seeking to employ people who are tolerant to disability and welcoming of people with disability to ensure that the diversity process takes place. Now, this is what a report looks like on the SACS measure of attitudes towards diversity. And we actually ask people these questions. And so what you can see here is that this is the score of a particular individual. The person's gender score is low. That's good. So the risk is low. But you see the ethnicity score is very high here, and that means a high risk. So this is a person, this 78, what that means is that this person, to get statistical about it for a moment, 50 is average. So that means the person's nearly 3 standard deviations above population average in terms of being intolerant to people with different ethnic backgrounds. I think you need to be careful about that. You need to reflect on that. So this, very briefly, we validated our measures of attitudes towards diversity and gender, gender and ethnicity, my apologies, against an international scale. We get a correlation of 0.7. That's good. That's what you're looking for. Just to draw some conclusions. Well, firstly, prejudice is measurable. Secondly, Prejudice is predictable. Thirdly, there are strong psychological markers for these characteristics, and we think you should measure for them. So we believe you can screen prospective hires for this. The simplest way of doing it is to use our instruments and basically look at the risk ratings. If the risk ratings are high on any of this stuff, and also the contributors like personality, cognitive ability, then reconsider your hiring processes. Organisations that have done this for some time have created more effective workforces. And I guess I'll finish off by saying, I reckon people vastly underestimate the impact of hiring practices in creating the corporate culture that they need. Some people think that corporate culture is only a matter of leadership. There are two levers to corporate culture: the quality of people that you let in through the front door and how you lead them once they're in. But you know what? If you've let the right people in through the front door, leading them is far easier. Have a great day, and thank you very much for listening.